there are different types of strategies that organisms can employ in order to succeed in an environment. Unfit people who have a psychological aversion to competition. If you are a relatively unfit individual and you know that you don't have a chance really to succeed against competitive groups of warrior-type people, one of their strategies is to identify with the enemy, because what they see successful Americans as their primary threat. And so they have a natural Darwinian philosophy and psychology that makes them sympathize with the enemy, because they think that the enemy's warriors can cull and reduce our warriors. That it's the reduction of the domestic warriors that is actually a significant advantage for them. That if we reduce the fit Americans, the unfit Americans, and it's not just physical fitness, it's just survivability. If you reduce the number of fit Americans, the breeding opportunities for unfit Americans goes up. So they sympathize with the enemy, and it's in their interest. It's in their personal genetic interest to have their warriors cull our warriors. And you can even take that argument to go even further and say they actually have a genetic advantage if an enemy defeats our warriors, because docility and lack of aggression and lack of competitive instincts, the lack of the willingness to fight, means that if an enemy eliminates all of the competitive Americans, the only ones left are the non-competitive Americans who have their heads down and are not fighters anyway. Now all of a sudden they make a perfect subject species, and they're perfectly willing to live in subjugation. They get the resource. Cuttlefish are actually fairly K-selected species, and when cuttlefish comes time to mate, because they have to be fit, right? They have to escape from predators. The ocean's not a friendly, peaceful place to be. And so when cuttlefish are in mating rituals, what they do is the females are smaller than the males. They have shorter tentacles and they're duller colors, and the females go down to the seabed and they find suitable mating areas like crevices and rocks and so on. And up above them, in the waters up above them, the males go through these incredible dominance displays, and these dominant displays are filled with these tremendously highly evolved series of pigmentations, and the strongest and fittest males have the best dominance displays, and they're also bigger and stronger, just like the rest of nature. And so the males will fight it out and do the dominance display, and if the dominance display doesn't intimidate the smaller male, then they'll get into an actual fight, and then the fittest will survive, and the fittest cuttlefish will go down and mate with the female cuttlefish, and the cuttlefish species is kept strong. But, as this guy points out, there is a certain type of unfit, smaller male cuttlefish that on some immediate level understands it can never compete with the other males. It's too small and too weak to compete with the males. So what this male cuttlefish does is he draws his tentacles in, and he assumes a very dull color, and he assumes the shape and color of a female, and he goes right through these warring males who would never let him pass if they recognize him as a male. He goes through these warring males disguised as a female, and he simply goes down to where the females are and mates with them. That's Woody Allen, right? That's Woody Allen and ants. You guys go out and duke it out, and I'll report back to battalion. But K-type psychologies, because they're constantly in competition, since they're constantly kind of in perpetual state of struggle, they have a very, very high regard for rules, and they have a very high regard for in-group structures. And so we have a large respect for law and order and rules on the conservative side of the spectrum. And I don't think liberals do. It's not in their interest to respect the rules. It's in their interest to succeed on their own. I'd rather lose by playing by the rules than win by cheating, because I'm wired that way. I'd rather lose and have played fair. I'd rather lose fairly than cheat by winning. Cheating to win is morally and psychologically repugnant to me. That makes sense among a K-type individual. But in our type individual, rules are for chumps. Why don't we just violently throw Barack Obama out of office? Why? If we're such competitive K-type individuals, why do we put up with it? Why do we know we should, but we don't? Why? It's because he was elected, right? Because he was elected, because he played by the rules, and we would rather lose by the rules than win by cheating. He won. We're stuck with it. Why don't our representatives do more than they do? I don't know. Couldn't we get better people? We should have better people. What happened? Well, we had an election, we lost. And so they are changing the rules and playing our ability and our desire, and not just our desire, our programming to respect the rules against us. And that's what Saul Alinsky said when he said in Rules for Radicals, if you want to beat conservatives, hold them up, make them accountable to their own morality, not to our morality. We don't have any morality. Make them accountable to their own morality. We have morality, and so we play by the rules. Barack Obama won 2 elections, whether he won them fairly or not, I don't know, but we play by the rules.
So that little clip there is a good introduction to what we might refer to as the conservative RK selection theory. And it's a seductive theory. It seems to fit into the mainstream view of politics, at least the Republican narrative, that the Democrats are welfare queens, they're socialists, they're lazy, they don't want to work, and therefore that must mean that the Republicans are the hard-working, K-selective people, right? So the Republicans are R-selective, they have a lot of kids, they're on welfare. Republicans are K-selective, they have less kids, they're more hard-working. That doesn't actually pan out demographically, so plenty of Democratic groups, let's say immigrants, Mexicans, people from Central America, people from South America, Muslims. So these groups have pretty high fertility. They have a high number of kids. And so, that might fit the narrative. But on the other hand, African Americans have below level fertility, below level replacement. You have other groups like Jews, Episcopalians, Hindus, people who you could say in some cases, if we're just going on number of children and that's the way you're judging things, well, maybe you can shoehorn that into your theory. But it doesn't really work because these 3 groups are extremely K-selective in the sense that they invest a lot into their children. So breaking out American politics into, well, you have the lazy people who are R-selective, and you have the hard-working people who are K-selective, and it's socialist versus capitalist. It doesn't work at all, because in fact, the groups which financially back the Democratic Party so that it has any power at all, these groups, again, groups like Jews, Asians, Episcopalians, Hindus, these people who lean toward the Democratic Party, they are not R-selective, they are K-selective. They invest heavily into their children, they have a long time horizon, they have low time preference. These are clearly K-selective groups, and yet they lean Democratic. Now, how could that fit into this theory? Well, it can't. The theory can't really account for that. In fact, the Democrats will look at things the opposite way. You look at people from New York City, coastal elites, and their complaint about Republicans is Republicans are dumb and they have too many kids. So it's almost as if we universally just understand R-selective as a derogatory term and K-selective as a complementary term, or that it is superior to be K-selective versus R-selective. I think we all understand that, but the 2 sides both look at each other as R-selective. Republicans look at Democrats as R-selective, and elite Democrats look at Republicans as R-selective. So clearly this is not getting us anywhere. This is not a proper analysis, because in fact, when we look at politics, we look at electoral democratic politics, it is a game of finance. It is a game of lobbying, first and foremost, and second of all, in terms of electioneering, it's a game of advertising. It's a game of media control. So it's a game of finance. Donald Trump built up financial capital, not in terms of, in the same sense that you could say a house has value. Now, can I put my house into a wood chipper and it's going to spit out dollar bills? No, someone actually has to buy it. So that's a subjective appraisal that goes on, that's subject to the market and subject to all these invisible factors. But we can say that my house has value or my car has value. In the same way that we can point to these tangible assets and say that they have a financial value, we can also point to intangible assets. So an intangible asset that Donald Trump had is he had connections, and he had reputation, and he had name recognition. So these were all financial assets that he had. Now, how easily transferable are they? Are they fungible? Can he just trade them? No, obviously, it's a little more difficult to take these kinds of assets and to liquefy them. We talk about liquid assets versus non-liquid assets, assets that you can easily sell, convert to cash very quickly, versus assets that are difficult to transfer. So obviously something like reputation, you can't just transfer that to someone else. But these are financial assets at the end of the day. Donald Trump used those to win the election. Hillary Clinton had a number of assets that she employed, but ultimately she wasn't able to win that game for whatever reason. So when we're looking at Democratic elections, before we even think about popularity contests, because a popularity contest implies that there are these axiomatic features of popularity that can't be influenced. It's a very naive view of popularity, the idea that people simply, they look at the field of candidates and they decide whoever they like the most based off their preconceived notions, and there's nothing you can do to manipulate anybody. That's just not the case, right? So a popularity contest is extremely vulnerable to mass manipulation, psychological suggestion, and these tactics are put forth quantitatively, qualitatively through mass media. That requires a lot of money, financial backing. These are billion-dollar industries when we're talking about mass media. These are billion-dollar industries, the influencer industry. You have a term called a socialite. A socialite is someone who just socializes. This is their job. They're friends with many, many different famous people, rich and powerful people. They don't do anything. They don't have an official task list. Their job is merely to socialize, to create network connections. And this itself adds value and gives them value and allows them to profit in innumerable ways. So in the same way, the entire, when we talk about democracy as a popularity contest, we're currently talking about a contest of finance against finance. That's what we're talking about in politics. So we're not talking about the conservative or Republican vision of democratic politics where it's like, well, the Democrats like Obama because he's giving them free stuff, and we like Mitt Romney because he is a capitalist or something like that. It's a very naive view that you have two camps with entrenched interests, entrenched axioms. They know what they want. They know who they're voting for. The level of informational transparency in a democratic election is very, very low. Even people operating on high levels of political discourse are completely fooled and bamboozled about the man who they thought they elected as Trump and the man who actually got into office as Trump. They're completely bamboozled. These are people who study the issue for hundreds of hours. They put out podcasts, they put out books, whatever. And they're just confused. And if those people are confused, you can bet your bottom dollar the majority, 99% of people are completely out of the loop. They don't know what's going on. The amount of transparency between what we might call axiomatic features of from a social Darwinist evolutionary perspective of okay, this person has a K selective strategy, this person has an R selective strategy, therefore they're just going to blindly pursue their strategy with a one-to-one correlation between their will, their desire, their evolutionary niche, and then whatever outcome that they choose. It's not clear-cut at all. There are many, many different levels of perceptual, cultural influence that are layered and stacked between the thought and the psychology and the individual and their final choices at the voting booth that are mediated by cultural influence through finance. So ultimately, when we talk about a democratic popularity contest, we're talking about millions of people, we're talking about billions of dollars in the media industry. We are not talking about people pursuing their libertarian praxeological self-interest. We're not talking about people pursuing their evolutionary genetic self-interest necessarily. You could have a scenario where people would vote against their interests, and we see this happening all the time. People voting against their interests. So the idea that democracy is about different tribal groups and they're voting to steal each other's stuff. That's not what's happening. What's happening is you have a group, many, many different groups of very confused people who have no clue what's going on. And they're voting semi-arbitrarily. That is, they're not voting with respect to outcomes. They're not voting for Donald Trump based on the outcomes because they can't predict the outcomes. They don't know what the outcomes are. So they're not voting based on outcomes. They're voting based on influences. And influences are very different from outcome. You know, promises are very different from outcome. So it's whoever can deceive and manipulate and influence the best, which is really a financial quantitative game. So at that point, you realize that it's not about the unproductive members of society versus the productive members, or the taxpayers versus the welfare queens. That is a narrative that's been sold to people, but has nothing to do with actual politics. Actual politics simply boils down to a financial game. And so if we view democratic politics in that sense, then we understand that really the only people who have political influence are not voters, because remember, voting laws can be changed. We could add voter ID laws. We could add a citizenship test. We could add stipulations about age. We could raise the voting age from 18 to 21. We could say you need to pay a voting tax. We could say you need to pass a voting test. All of these measures could completely change the playing field. Because currently we have a system in which illegal aliens are allowed to vote. We have a system in which people without driver's licenses are allowed to vote. People who are felons now in Florida are allowed to vote. Increasingly, you know, the idea that felons are given the right to vote is just something that's really a hot issue for Democrats, because they know it'll get them more votes, especially in slimly contested elections. So before we even talk about the popularity contest of voting, we have to talk about the culture and the laws and the rules and the regulations that surround the voting process itself, right? So if you just tweak the rules ever so slightly, you could say, well, you can't vote if you're a felon. You can't vote if you owe this much in taxes. You can't vote if your credit score is bad. You can't vote if you've committed a misdemeanor. There are so many little tiny insignificant things you could change about voting that would completely result in absolute landslides for one party or the other. So for instance, if you said you can vote so long as you are a resident of the United States, you don't need to be a citizen, you just need to be a resident, just need to live here, you just need to be present in the country and have some form of ID, then Republicans would never win any election anywhere ever again. If you did the opposite, if you said that you need to have a valid driver's license, or you need to have a valid passport, I mean, wow, that would blow it out of the water, because overwhelmingly the people who are passport holders in America are white. So Democrats would never win another election ever again, basically. These are very small, insignificant bureaucratic changes, and these changes are financial, right? They're not popularly voted for. People do not vote for the laws. We have a republic, not a democracy. So there's no direct popular influence on the law, and the law structures the democratic process. And the laws have been changing for a while. First, it was just men who were white who owned property, and then it became all men, and then it became men and women, and then, you know, the stipulations keep changing from there, and then felons can vote, you know. So when you change the rules of the popularity contest, you make the contest itself irrelevant. It doesn't matter who is the better arguer. It doesn't matter if you appeal to this or that. What matters is, what are the rules of the game? What are the rules surrounding the contest? And how are those rules determined? Not popularly at all. They're all backroom deals. It's all lobbying. It's all financial power. So at the end of the day, that's what it comes down to. And if you want to do a political analysis between who are the political agents in the country, what do they want, who are the power centers, who are the opposing camps? Well, 99% of the people just don't factor in at all. They don't matter, essentially. They are dead weight as far as the political process goes. So in that sense, the popularity contest of democracy is a sham. It's a facade. It isn't real because it does not determine the outcome of elections. The financial superstructure determines the outcomes of elections. So who controls that financial superstructure? Okay. Well, now we can start talking about the people who are rich in America. And welfare queens and people who live off government subsidies are not in control in America. They don't have political power directly. They can be used as political pawns and tools in a political game. They can be used to legitimize the result of elections. They can say, hey, look, we won 51% of the vote. How did we do that? We imported millions of illegals. We broke up the nuclear family, so we have a bunch of single moms. We took all kinds of dysgenic societal trends to increase the number of people who are dependent upon the government. You do all that in order to fluff your numbers to legitimize the results. But that's only a tactic of legitimacy to shut up the right wing, who, as pointed out in the initial clip, the right wing is more willing to lose on quote-unquote fair terms than to win by cheating. So that is a way to silence the right wing, to pacify the right wing. But it isn't the way you actually win the election. The way you win the election is by getting the money power on your side. So then we say, oh, okay, all that matters is money. It's not number of votes, it's money. That's it. So who has the money? Well, the Hindus have some money, and the Jews have some money, and the Episcopalians have some money. And then we go back to the initial question of who is the red tribe, blue tribe? Who are the political factions in the country? It's not the taxpayers versus the welfare queens. Get that out of your mind. That is a conservative miasma. That is a spider web that's meant to entrap you, to entangle you, to confuse you, and to waste your time, so you're engaging with a simulacrum of the political process rather than the political process itself. The political process itself is controlled by those who have money power. And so when we look at the different factions on the right and the left, we have to eliminate from our thinking the voter base, the demographic base. Demographics is destiny is a lie. It's another, this is a more advanced lie that white nationalists tell. Oh, demographics is destiny. Demographics has nothing to do with destiny. Demographics has nothing to do with who controls the country. You can have millions of people. This is what colonial India was. You have millions of people who are controlled by a very, very small number of people. The demographics of India was overwhelmingly Indian. Who ruled India? Not the Indians, right? So those who rule the country are not those who have a demographic majority. That's the lie of white nationalism that they keep telling over and over to, again, distract and obscure and give false hope that, oh, if we can only get a majority here, a majority there, maybe if we move to this corner of the country, maybe we can set up an ethno-state. All of these ridiculous false distractions that bog people down. And then you see, you get into that and you realize the hopelessness of that, and then you have like this, you're arguing within a false paradigm. The true paradigm is who has the money power? And that's groups like Episcopalians, Jews, Hindus, Buddhists. These are people who are case selective. These are people who invest in their children. These are people who value education. These are people with high skill sets who perform well in a capitalist financial economy. And they vote and they lean Democrat, not Republican. So who votes Republican? Well, it's Baptists and white people and evangelicals and people of this background. So at the end of the day, it is not correct to say that the world or the political process is split between R selectors and K selectors. That's not true. R selectors play no role except as an after effect, a legitimizing effect, an excuse, a justification for the results of an election. They don't actually instigate the rules. They don't define the terms, and he who defines the terms defines the game. He who counts the vote determines the course of the election. And the vote counting process is determined by the rules of eligibility, which are established by financial powers, not by the masses. That's true. So that being the case, then we have the fact that you have not R selectors versus K selectors, but you have K selectors versus K selectors. You have financial powers versus financial powers. So you have groups who are, and I think the initial clip describes this well, groups who are wary of majoritarian strategies, groups who are wary of Western chauvinism, groups who are wary of historical European civilizations, wary of them for a number of reasons, either because they don't fit in or because they've had past conflicts with this civilization for whatever reason, they're wary of the idea of a cohesive Western European society. It scares them, it troubles them, it gives them nightmares, it gets them paranoid, and with good justification oftentimes, because of history. You know, the best predictor of the future is the past. They'll look at the past and they say, well, you know, these people tended to be really violent, they tended to dominate us, they tended to outcompete us. So we're going to be wary, we're going to be cautious of them having a majority. And so the instinct there is to protect ourselves. We have to divide and conquer. We have to attack this majority. We have to promote minority groups. So we have to seek out those groups that don't fit into society, and this is what's termed intersectionality. So one minority group says, oh, I'm kind of scared of traditional European Western society, so I'm going to ally myself with other groups who also have the similar fear. So it's an alliance of fear, which is a pretty strong alliance. What is that movie with the Will Smith, Independence Day? So you have all the cultures of the world, Soviet Union, United States, Africa, India, Japan, whatever. You know, normally they might not get along, normally they might have their differences, but because the aliens are attacking, they can all unite under the banner of humanity, put aside their differences, and come together because they have a common scapegoat, they have a common enemy. So fear is a powerful element in uniting diverse groups of people. So long as you have the boogeyman, the scarecrow of white nationalism, you're always going to be able to unite all these disparate groups, which is why it's so important to keep the myth of white nationalism alive, even if it doesn't exist, even if it's not a threat. This is the argument I get into with white nationalists, where they say, hey, look, we're being censored, we're under attack, therefore we must be potent, we must be powerful. There must be something to white nationalism. It must be a legitimate idea. It must be threatening to the establishment, otherwise they wouldn't dedicate so much resources toward attacking us. That's not, again, that is a very superficial, surface level analysis, implying that actions are taken for their ostensive reasoning. So if we say we're afraid of white nationalists, so we've got to really, you know, stamp out the white nationalists, you're taking that justification at face value without analyzing the deeper societal, psychological, cultural necessity of that action. There has to be some kind of unifying boogeyman, fear factor, thanatos, that brings all these disparate groups together. That is white nationalism. And so white nationalism is simultaneously pumped up, and at the same time, it is attacked. And so the system unleashes itself on white nationalism and allows the cat ladies and the church ladies and the bureaucrats and the people who don't understand what's going on, who just buy the propaganda, oh, white nationalism is so scary, we have to attack white nationalism. So they hop on board that train. There are a lot of low-level, petite bourgeois people who are middle managers in the system. They don't really know what's going on. These are people like content creators at YouTube, content, or curators, I should say. These are curators, people who censor content on YouTube, Google. They're not controlling the infrastructure. They didn't create it. They don't work in the CIA. They don't understand global geopolitics. They have no clue what's going on. All they know is the correct ideology is to stamp out white nationalism, so that's what we're going to do. And they dedicate their time and energy and resources to attacking white nationalism, which serves as a unifying culture. This anti-whiteness serves as a unifying culture for the multicultural America. That doesn't mean that white nationalism in itself is a threatening or competent or well thought out or powerful idea. It's a powerful anti-idea. It's a powerful scapegoat. It's a good dead horse to beat. You know, it's like, how are we going to, it's like a team building exercise. You have the employees of Google, and they're like, how are we going to get all these disparate people who don't like each other, they don't fit it, they don't have a common identity, how are we going to get them to have some kind of shared sense of enemy, a shared in-group distinction, in-group, out-group? We're going to define the out-group as white nationalists, as a dead horse, and we're going to have them go out and beat that dead horse. And so we're going to, again, it's a simultaneously, you pump up white nationalism, you constantly mention it, and so therefore you make it popular, because there are disaffected white people, and they're like, hey, I don't know what to do, I'm very confused, I don't have an identity. well, the media keeps telling me white nationalism is evil, so I'm going to go be attracted to that. So you're always going to have, between 1 and 10% of the population of disaffected people who, if you pump up something scary and evil, they're going to be attracted to what's scary and evil. This was the Goth movement. The linguistic slang, the change from, the word bad now means good. Oh, she bad. That means she's good. The word bad, sick, gnarly, all of these terms which were bad, negative, then became positive. They became cool. They became hip. So this is a process that you're always going to have a marginalized group in society that's going to see what the majority says is evil, and they're going to be attracted to that because they're already marginalized. So they say, what do I have to lose? They're going to be attracted to this marginalized group because they feel like that's the place where they can finally fit in. So the media pumps up white nationalism as this evil thing that no one should ever do. And so you're going to have 1 to 10% of white people being attracted to white nationalism as a big middle finger to the establishment. Doesn't mean it's effective, doesn't mean it's growing, doesn't mean it's any bigger than it was in the 1990s or the 1980s or the 1970s or the 1960s or the 1950s or the 1940s or 30s or 20s. By the time we get to the 20s, actually, white nationalism was a lot more mainstream than it is today. But in the sense of, and I have a video on this, history of America, history of white nationalism, going through that transition period where it went from being something mainstream to being something taboo. And that was a process that really happened in the 20s and the 30s, that shift, in the same way that we had a shift from Democrats being the party of the South, Democrats being the party of the North, Republicans being the party of the North, Republicans being the party of the South. So that's the kind of polar shift that I'm talking about here that happened in the American mainstream. Racism went from being in vogue, popular, normal, mainstream to now being taboo, marginal. So you're always, when the media constantly mentions white nationalism, that's going to funnel hundreds of thousands of white people into white nationalism. And they're going to serve as scarecrows and boogeymen and dead horses that the rest of society, that the rest of coastal elites and the diverse intersectional alliance can form a circle around this little marginalized group that doesn't have any power, it doesn't have any money, which is the important thing. And they're going to get around, they're going to beat these people, they're going to dox them, they're going to harass them, they're going to bring up them in a demonological way, in the same way that medieval Christians would really get fanatical about listing all the names of the demons and their attributes and their traits. They would provide illustrations. Why did they do this? Because there's an inverse of worship, and I don't have a good term for it, but it's a negative worship, in the same way that we, like, Christians worship Christ and they devote prayers to Christ. At the same time, they're as obsessive, if not more obsessive, about detailing the qualities and the attributes of their enemies. So we hate those demons, and we're gonna obsessively detail them and understand them and talk about them and create a whole demonology about them. This is what is the function of white nationalism in our society, is to provide a demonology so that the social center can be held together by this negative specter of white nationalism. That is why it is promoted in the media as a negative force. Hey, don't be like this. A certain number of marginalized whites are going to be basically tricked into adopting it. Or, oh, well, if the mainstream media says it's evil, it must be good. So you get a certain marginalized group who goes toward it. This marginalized group is quite dysfunctional. They're prone to things like infighting. They don't have a lot of financial capital. They don't necessarily have the most intellectual capital, although they tend to be above average intelligence, because they're if you're of average intelligence, it's really easy to just blend in with society. When you're above average intelligence, there is this feeling of being left out. So they're going to tend to be above average intelligence, but they're going to tend to be have a lot of addictions, be depressed, be into drugs, alcohol use, and not have a lot of financial capital. So they're not going to be able to build anything. They're not going to be a serious threat to the system, but the system will always have to identify them as the most serious threat. People don't understand this distinction, that the system could possibly pump up a group as really evil and threatening. In the same way, this I remember it was like Ramsey Paul years ago would make this comparison and say that white people and white nationalism is like witchcraft, and they're heretics and heathens, and the left they're like Puritans. And so basically the crusade against white nationalism is like the Salem witch trials, and that's a very good metaphor. But no one ever took that metaphor on the white nationalist side. No one was self-conscious enough to say, hey, if that's true, then who were those witches? Were they actually threatening, Puritan society? No. Those witches, maybe they were really into witchcraft. Maybe they were innocent women. Who knows? But those few women were not a serious threat to Puritan society. However, it was important that in order to maintain the cohesion of Puritan society, to maintain its fervor, they had to create a demonology. And the individuals who were chosen to fit the bill for that demonology were these so-called witches. So the witch, there was a necessary enemy which had to be invented, even if it didn't exist, even if the women were innocent. It had to be invented in order for Puritan society to survive. When Puritan society stopped burning witches is when they stopped being true Puritans, and they lost their religious fervor, and they became, mainstream Episcopalians, essentially. So what I'm saying is, in order to maintain a strong social center, you have to have an enemy at the gates who provides the psychological thanatos to scare everybody into line and to create cohesion. White nationalists serve that function. They are the witches of the present day. Just as the witches of the 17th century, they have no power, they're not a threat, they're not going to do anything, they're not capable of organization, they don't have money, they might talk big talk, but at the end of the day, the biggest threat that they pose is as spree killers and spree shooters who, might kill a few thousand people a year, which, considering there are billions of people on the planet, is not a serious threat. It's not a serious threat. In the same way that ISIS was pumped up in this way. ISIS was funded by the U.S. government, and then it was used as a justification to get more involved in the Middle East. And then because people don't understand Middle East, the same exact thing. It's so predictable how people are fooled, where you say Osama bin Laden and the Taliban attacked America, therefore we have to kill Saddam Hussein. So people who are enemies, that is the secular dictator Saddam Hussein, and then the Taliban leader Osama bin Laden, people who are enemies because Osama bin Laden was Saudi Arabian, and Saddam Hussein was threatening the hegemony of Saudi Arabia. So you had two different Middle Eastern powers who were fighting against each other, and you use the one to justify an action against the other. This is the kind of manipulation and deception that goes on, and it happens again and again and again. So, to believe that because the media is pointing out white nationalism as a threat, that this somehow justifies or legitimizes white nationalism, in fact, is not true. To accept this and to believe this and to buy into this means you are just as foolish and naive as someone who buys into the reality of the democratic process, the idea that democracy represents the legitimate will of the people. That's obviously not the case, and it's obviously not the case that white nationalism is a legitimate threat or something that actually has the capability to change the political system as we know it. The power players are not welfare queens. They're not white nationalists. They're people with money. And those groups are groups like Jews and Hindus and Episcopalians and Buddhists. These are the power players. These are the people who have money. These are the people who are influencing politics. And if you don't like what they're doing, or you're critical of them or something like that, the counter strategy is not to have a bunch of white children. The counter strategy is not to move to the Pacific Northwest. The counter strategy is not to promote white nationalism, to marginalize yourself and to alienate yourself from your friends and family and community. The counter strategy, well, essentially, if you want to win this political game, which is a financial game, so the rules of the game are whoever has the most money, then the way to win is to make money and to counter the money of these people with your own money. That's one way to win. Now, some people might not like that. Some people will say, well, I don't like making money. That's against my ethical code. I believe money is dirty, and I don't like the capitalist game. Well, I can't change your mind on that. So, I can't force people to win. But if you wanted to win the current political game, that's what you would have to do. Otherwise, you have to have some fantasy about an impending collapse, which, implies that there is some external force that's going to come along and push us over the edge. I don't know what that external force would look like. For Rome, you had the Romanized Germans. So the Germans for hundreds of years were very resistant to Rome, but over hundreds of years they continuously adopted more and more Roman customs and traditions and military strategies. So when we talk about the Battle of Teutoburg Forest, led by Arminius wasn't using German tactics against Roman tactics. Arminius was a German who was raised in Rome. He was raised in Rome by the Romans, and then he went back to the lands of Germany, and he learned from the Romans, he used their tactics against them. So really, it was these Germans who had been Romanized. They had learned Roman military strategy. They had adopted Roman military technology. And we have this idea that the Germans who invaded Rome were wearing like horned helmets and traditional like Viking garb and all this stuff, which is nonsense. They were wearing Roman military equipment. They learned over time, they said the Romans have the best weapons and swords and armor, so we're just going to trade with them, and we're going to buy all of their weapons and armor. We're going to serve as mercenaries in their armies. We're going to learn how they operate. We're going to learn everything from them. We're going to take their material technologies as well as their tactical or strategic technologies, being intangible assets, but nonetheless, these are technologies, mimetic rather than material. We're going to take all these technologies, and then once Rome is weak enough, and we're a high percentage enough of their mercenary force, that they don't have a counter force against us. At the point that the Germans became a majority of the Roman Empire, Roman army, and then the Germans within their own right in the north had amassed certain armies, they had an opportunity with a divided Rome, a weakened Rome, to sweep in and to take over. They didn't destroy Rome. This is something people don't realize. They went in and they said, okay, now we are the Roman kings. You Italians, you don't rule Rome anymore. The German tribes, we are the inheritors of Rome. That's how they viewed it. They didn't come to destroy Rome. They didn't come because they hated Rome. They came because they loved Rome and they wanted to save Rome, in a way. Now, to get them to, if you actually talk to some of these guys, Odoacer and these ancient Germanic kings who became kings of Italy and kings of Spain and kings of North Africa, they might not have told you, oh, we're doing this because we love Rome. But they were fanatically adherent, they were more adherent to the Roman model than the degenerate Italians who were ruling at the time. They were more Roman than the Romans, that's what I'm trying to say. They carried on the tradition of Roman law. They accepted the Roman church. And, the chief among them came to be Charlemagne and the Franks, who were Trinitarians rather than followers of Arius, who was a non-Trinitarian Christian. And there was that whole contest there. But the reason why Charlemagne came out on top is because he was most adherent to the Church of Rome, which was still Trinitarian. So there's this way in which the Germans who invaded were more Roman than the Romans were. They carried on the Roman tradition. This is why the Holy Roman Empire, people make fun of the name. It wasn't holy, it wasn't Roman, it wasn't an empire. It was all of those things. It was a sacral empire where the emperor believed he had the right to appoint bishops, and he did so for much of German history, which was later contested in the 12th century by Pope Gregory VII, He said, no, 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 the emperor is below a priest. But that wasn't the traditional German concept of kingship. It was a divine kingship who had the ability. He was a pope in his own right, essentially, in the modern sense of the word. He had the ability to appoint bishops. He was the head of the church. And that was later reinstated with Anglicanism, where Henry VIII said, I have the right to appoint bishops. I'm the head of this church here in England, the Anglican Church. That was something that the Germanic kings had felt themselves to have that right for a long time. They felt that their kingship was a holy kingship. So it was holy. It was imperial in the sense that there was an emperor who ruled over Burgundy, which was mostly French-speaking. He ruled over northern Italy, which was Italian-speaking. He ruled over Germany, which was German-speaking. He also ruled over Slavic lands where Polish people lived and Czech people lived, and the Slovenian people lived. So it was imperial, it was holy, and it was Roman. It was Roman in the sense that they were carrying on the legal tradition, the military tradition, the traditions of Rome that they adopted through their interactions with the Romans. When the Romans had essentially given up the mantle, they gave up the ghost in a Spenglerian sense. They lost their vital life energy, and then the Romans sort of picked up where they left off. So who is the candidate to do that in this situation? Who is the candidate? I don't know, maybe China. China, they certainly like classical European music. And they train their children, they train orchestras to play classical European music. So that could be a parallel. I don't see Hispanic America as really picking up. I mean, Catholics would certainly say that, oh, well, the Hispanics are picking up where the Catholics left off. I don't see that as being the case. I see a huge amount of liberalization going on in places like Argentina and even Brazil, which was supposed to, Bolsonaro is going to be this, right-wing Catholic guy, and he's just another drug lord, apparently, with cocaine on the airplane. I mean, how are selective can you get? How high time preference can you get? It's pretty pathetic. It's a sham. So I don't see South America blossoming into some. Probably Mexico has the best future ahead of it, because all of its worst people are going north into America, and meanwhile they're practicing white supremacy with a white judiciary and a white presidency. They have a huge problem with the drug trade, which is partially America's fault. It's partially engineered by America in a number of ways. And so they have entire regions of the country that are just controlled by drug lords. So it's not in a sense, it's almost a failed state, similar to Somalia, where the federal government just doesn't have control. There are these factions that are fighting in the streets and beheading people. So there's some real bad problems in Mexico. But as America becomes more Hispanic, that's going to be to Mexico's advantage. And there are a lot of industry is moving to Mexico. So Mexico has some good times ahead of it. But is it going to be able to overshadow America? Is it going to be able to take on the American model? One thing to note about the German takeover of the Roman Empire is that they adopted the Latin language. They adopted the Latin language as the holy sacred language, because that's how much they respected the Romans and viewed the Romans as their ancestors in a way. That they adopted the Latin language as the language of the church, as the language of liturgy, as the language of the Bible, the Vulgate. They weren't into Greek, they were into Latin. And Germans spoke Latin, educated Germans spoke Latin, and they wrote in Latin, and Latin influenced the German language to a degree. And this was common, up until essentially French came to overshadow Latin to a large degree. But when Linnaeus, who is Swedish, but within that Germanic realm, when he was coming up with binomial nomenclature, he used Latin. So up until the 17th, 18th centuries, even up until the 19th century, Latin was still something that was viewed as the language of science, because it had been previously the language of religion. And the distinction between the two and the transition between the two was mediated by alchemy, which again, the language of alchemy was the language of Latin. If you read an alchemical text, it's going to be Latin. So, are the Mexicans going to do that? Are they going to adopt English as a sacred language and carry on the American dream or something like that? I don't know if that's very likely. Again, a better candidate would be someone like China. Spangler apparently predicted that Russia would be the next great civilization. I don't see that happening. I see all the degenerative trends that go on in the West are occurring at the same velocity in Russia. It's just that Russia was to a degree protected by a communist state, which was very conservative in orientation. And so, whereas the West had the 1960s sexual revolution, Soviet Union never had the sexual revolution of the 1960s. Their sexual revolution was in the 1920s, and it was then basically progressively covered up and reversed over a number of decades. So by the time you got to the 1980s, homosexuality was illegal in the Soviet Union. It was legal in the United States of America. So by the time you get to the 90s, the Soviet Union collapses. You get to this crossover point where America is now talking about gay rights and we're getting into gay marriage, and Russia is reacting to this because all of a sudden the world has been opened up and it's experiencing and being introduced to all of these new ideologies that have been introduced progressively and slowly, boiling the frog in America, and it's just a shock to the system of Russia. And it's very disruptive, but the case is that they're adopting these views. Social media is huge. In that young Russians experience American culture in a shock wave. And they are desensitized to American culture. And the Russians who are raised in this culture and who are having children, who are the future of Russia, they are totally acclimated to American culture. They're not going back to the churches. The idea of some kind of Christian revival in Russia is as imaginary as the idea of a Christian revival in America. What might happen in America is that Christianity in various factions, the Mormons, the evangelicals, the Baptists, various factions become entrenched and become fundamentalist and go live out in the woods in compounds. Like this does happen. You have the Amish. So the Amish model is open. You can have a reactionary Christian group which segregates itself from society. In fact, in Russia, you have this group which existed at least until the 19th century called the Old Believers. And they essentially didn't accept many of the reforms of the Orthodox Church. They practiced castration. In many ways, they were very similar to the Quakers and the Shakers in America, practicing celibacy, in fact, having similarities to the Cathars and the Albigensians. So this is, this Gnostic trait in Christianity, something that comes up again and again because it's just what you read in the Bible. I mean, the Bible is very Gnostic. The New Testament especially is very Gnostic and antinatal and anti-materialistic and pro-celibacy. It's not something that you can get around if you're purely relying on the sola scriptura. But if you have tradition, then you can kind of ignore that, syncretize it, Germanize it, and you can cover it over with what's been called Catholicism, traditional Christianity, Germanic Christianity, and you can avoid those trends by having a very strong hierarchy, a strong tradition. You can, and Baptists do this to an extent. The Amish do this to an extent, where they're able to counteract those trends through culture. This balancing act that's played. But anytime someone cracks open the Bible and they just get wild with the sola scriptura and just reading the words literally, without any kind of mediation and just being totally independent and puritanical about it and relying upon their own interpretation, this Gnosticism is always going to pop up over and over again, and it did in Russia. And so you're going to have these secluded sects of Christians who are going to survive and whatever, but that's not going to be some like general revival in the country of Christianity. You're not going to see that. You're not going to see that unless the internet is shut down, and that's why I did make an abridged version. You know, it's funny because it's still an hour long, so you're still going to need to sit down and take some time to understand what's being said by John David Ebert and Michael Commons and Joel Davis. You're still going to need to dedicate some time to understand what they're saying. I edited it. I took the time to edit it. What a strange word that word is, edit. It has too much consonants, too much repetition in it. But I took the time to curate the video, to cut down the video, because I wanted to soak in the video, to understand the video. And that is, I think, the definitive question. Are we going to shut down the internet? If you keep the internet going, all of these social trends that we see going on, the morality of hypermodernism, which some people call cultural Marxism, some people call it liberalism, really none of those terms are really adequate for describing what's going on. They all have their own problems, they all have their own confusions and distractions. But if we're to talk about this in a hypermodernist paradigm, you're not going to escape the moral trend of hypermodernism. You're not going to escape the internet as a moral force unless you shut it down. That's the only solution. That's something that increasingly China has been working with Google and other major corporations basically to try to tightly control the internet as much as possible. You still get Chinese people who break through the Great Firewall. They still break through. You can still find Chinese people who live in China who have access to Western media and Western morality and Western hypermodernism. And so that's a flaw there. That's a leak in the system. North Korea is probably doing the perfect job of it, but North Korea is pretty small. North Korea is not capable of defending itself. It relies upon China to defend it, essentially. Without China, North Korea can't survive. It's a client state of China. So, you know, you're going to have to, at some point, you either have to just totally stop the train, throw it off the tracks, burn it up for scrap, whatever. You have to completely stop the process of the internet as a technology, which leads to this hyper-modern moral environment, which is teleological and is there's a moral determinism to the internet. It's not a morally neutral medium that we just pass through and everything is just accelerated. For conservative liberals, everything is just accelerated in terms of time scale. No, as we change our perception of time, we change our perception of morality. And ultimately, what we can define as conservative morality is dependent upon low time preference, long time horizon. The internet shortens our time horizon and increases our time preference. Conservative morality cannot survive on the internet, and that's why when we see quote-unquote conservative morality on the internet, it's baby boomers who don't have the mental plasticity to change, or it's these young alt-right white nationalist people who are expressing a hypocritical, erotic, fetishistic version of conservative morality, which is not conservative, but it's a type of middle finger to the establishment. It's not an ideology in itself. It's simply a troll. It's simply a insult. It's simply an act of rebellion, a statement of rebellion, rather than a coherent political system or a moral system. It is designed to elicit a reaction rather than designed to create a civilization. That's the difference there. So a true conservative morality, a civilizational sustaining, culture sustaining morality can't exist within the internet unless we go into a transhumanist mode and we actually fully integrate. Because right now there's this distance and divergence between the human as an organism and the internet as an organism. And only once you bridge that gap, that material gap, either by integrating the internet into humanity, integrating humanity into the internet, some form of transhumanism is required in order to bridge that gap and to then truly create a moral, cultural system which is self-sustaining and conservative and works. That's the only solution. You either destroy the internet or you transmute humanity into something beyond humanity. And that's kind of what John says is that Heidegger's position is that you need God to come back to destroy technology, and Ted Kaczynski says, much of the same, being, I think, a little more naive than Heidegger. I don't know if Kaczynski ever read Heidegger. He should have, before he decided to be violent. But these back to nature people in the German school, they want to destroy the internet. And if they can achieve that, then they can win. Temporarily, at least, until the internet's reinvented by someone at some time and somewhere. But the other alternative is the Nietzschean school, which is also a German school. It also comes out of Germany to a degree. But the Nietzschean school says, no, we're not going to destroy the internet. We could try to destroy it once, but it's just going to come back. Really what we need to do is we need to go through this process. And Commons mentioned Giorgiani. So I haven't read Giorgiani, but it sounds like Giorgiani says, well, we have this psychological need for Faustianism. We need to explore that in terms of mysticism, in terms of telepathy, and all sorts of investigation into the supernatural. We need to do it in a scientific way. We need to do it in an alchemical way, almost making a pragmatic argument, from what I understood from Commons' interpretation, almost make it a pragmatic argument of even if it isn't true in some kind of literal materialistic sense, we still have to pursue and investigate, because this is the infinite space that we are designed to expand into. And if we don't expand into that, we're going to self-destruct, because we're trying to contain our nature, and if we don't release what's within us, it's going to destroy us. So that seems to be Giorgiani's argument, so there can be merit to that, but ultimately that's going to lead to a hybridization of humanity and the internet along the lines of what Nietzsche predicted. And, those are your two options. So, yeah, as far as destroying the internet, I'm a little bit fatalistic, pessimistic about that as being even an option, a possibility in the grand scheme of things. I think the Nietzschean and maybe what Giorgiani is saying, if that's a correct interpretation, the transhumanist of saying, we're going to have to go through this, we're going to have to accept it for what it is, we're going to have to integrate into it, and only through integration can we get back to a feeling of conservation and cultivation and civilization. But until we integrate, there's always going to be this dissonance, which we call liberalism or postmodernism or cultural Marxism. There's always going to be this dissonance of feeling that culture is liquefying, feeling that everything is disintegrating, feeling that everything is confused. Until we can fully integrate our instinctual genetic makeup and psychology with the implications of new technology, until we can do that, there's always going to be this conflict and confusion. So I think in that way, I guess I would be an accelerationist according to the dichotomy that was brought up. I don't think blowing up the internet is a legitimate long-term solution. You can see times and places in which that's possible. I don't think it's sustainable in the long term. So, people can advocate for that, and maybe that's what they feel is a psychological necessity. Although it's always interesting when they use the internet itself to advocate for destroying the internet. And I wonder what Kaczynski would think about his manifesto being most widely read on technological platforms rather than pen and paper or something like that. Most people read it online. It's through technology that we know about the writings of Kaczynski. It's through technology today. The new generation is reading Heidegger. Maybe there people who are this autistic are going to go ahead and buy the paper copy. But you're hearing about him through these translations. You're hearing about him through these transmutations, transcriptions, summaries, bits and pieces, modulated. There's a module construction. This is my understanding of Heidegger. My experience of Heidegger is not one of sitting down with his German hardcover book and flipping through it and making notes and underlining words. It's a modular experience of Heideggerianism as I get one piece from one summary, one piece from another summary, experiencing that critique of hypermodernism through hypermodernism itself. It's inescapable. So we can understand it. We can try to change ourselves and regulate ourselves in accordance with our understanding of history, where we come from, where we are, and where we're going. We don't have to, accepting or being a fatalist or being an accelerationist doesn't mean that you self-destruct necessarily, or that you give up on life or you become passive. But in my opinion, you're granted a new teleology, in which, now that you finally understand what's going on, and now that it's, you're not fighting against the current, you're fighting with the current. Now you have a fighting chance. Now you have hope. Now you have motivation. If you are confident in what the future will be like, and you've acclimated yourself, you've accepted the future, then you can have the spirit of the left. The spirit of the left is the spirit of the progressive. The spirit of the left is we're on the right side of history. The spirit of the left is, history has been going in this direction for hundreds, if not thousands of years, and we're just continuing on that path, and therefore we're on the winning team. It feels good to be on the winning team. That's why in elections, you try to produce the perception that your opponent is losing and you're winning. Because the more confident that you can get your team members to believe that you are the winning side, the more they're going to invest. Because if you think you're on the losing side, then investing in the losing side is suicidal. Very few people are willing to do that. But if you believe you're on the winning side, then investing in the winning side means you're going to reap the benefits of the victory. You're sure that you're going to win. You invest in the victory, and then you get to reap the rewards of saying, yeah, I was on the winning side. Whether those are tangible, whether those are psychological, emotional, you always want to believe you're on the winning side. So once you have a coherent view of the future, futurology, and you know where we're going, and you've accepted it for what it is, and then you say, okay, what is my place in this? How am I going to help this along? There's so many people who are trying to get rich quick and trying to develop artificial intelligence and do these things. So, in a way, that's not the big problem. The big problem is, well, there's an individual problem of not understanding what's going on, being confused, being self-destructive, being fatalistic, being pessimistic, having on the one hand being, oh, I wish we lived in the 1950s, oh, I wish I was Amish. So many people, they wish they're Amish. It's like, there's probably an Amish community within 50 miles of you. If you look really hard, if you go on the internet, you could probably find an Amish community within 50 miles. And you could probably go there and surrender yourself and say, hey, please, would you invite me into your Amish community? I'll do anything. And, have you at least tried? I'm not saying they're going to accept you 100%, but have you at least tried? But there are these people who fetishize the Amish, yet they're not willing to join the Amish. So there's this cognitive dissonance where it's like, I wish I was Amish, essentially, but I'm going to refuse. I'm not even going to attempt to join the Amish because I have this guilt and I'm not worthy to be Amish. I'm not pure enough. So there's a lot of self-hatred that goes into it. There's a lot of perfectionism that goes into it. It's very weird. It's very voyeuristic, this nostalgia for the past, but being unwilling to actually practice what you preach, or to live out the morality that you have in your head that you obsess about. It's very strange that people are trapped in this, but this is actually the situation we're facing. And if you can escape that, and you can just accept your own limitations, where you are, and then see history and see the future, and then you can come up with a model of where you fit in to actual reality. So the direct application is you make a lot of money and you invest in technology and science, and you further the process in that way. You get us closer to some sort of holistic synthesis with technology. The other aspect is you try to psychologically acclimate people to this, and you try to make people understand, hey, this is what's going on. And you as an individual are not really powerful enough. Maybe even humanity as a whole is not really powerful enough. It's funny when Elon Musk talks about the the dangers of artificial intelligence, and then he starts talking about we're going to implant chips in people's brains here at whatever his company is, Tesla. I don't remember what his whole enterprise is called, Musk Enterprises. Yeah, so there's this this fear that people have, this instinctual fear, and you can't necessarily rationally argue with it. You can't like I can't just give people the data points and say this is what's happening. And you say, well, I still don't know, man. I'm not certain about that. So at the end of the day, it is an emotional, psychological process that people need to go through. And I think it can be done to some people. I think you can change people's minds, but you can't do it with facts, and because feelings don't care about your facts. If people are scared about the future and they're scared about technology and they think it's ugly and they think it's disgusting, they think it's nightmarish, you can't change that person's mind with data. You can't change it with facts because they know what the facts are, right? The field of facts, I think we all understand on some level what the facts are, but it is our emotional attachment and it's our emotional perception of those facts and how we interpret those facts that makes all the difference. So coming up with mythologies and emotional systems and social systems that you acclimate people and you get people to understand what's going on and what their place is in it, and create some form of chain of being or some kind of logical progression or some evolution from Pichu to Pikachu to Raichu. You create some kind of progression there that makes sense, that is logical, that seems natural, that seems normal, that seems acceptable. If you can normalize that, then you can get people out of that stage where they're just freaking out and feeling like a cornered animal, feeling like they're being buried alive, and they can start feeling like a salmon who's swimming with the current. You're not fighting against the current. You don't hate the current. You don't feel enslaved by the current, but you're almost one with the current. And you're looking at history and you're looking at yourself and you're not seeing this grand contradiction, but you're seeing a connection. And no matter how small you are, no matter how insignificant you are, if you feel connected to some kind of grand narrative, then you can achieve so much more than if you're just feeling like you're being buried alive, like the animal cornered in the corner. What's the better way to phrase that? Animal who's trapped in a corner and is acting crazy and nervous and neurotic and full of anxiety. That's just going to produce a lot of frictional emotional energy, meaning you're just going to be constantly self-destructing and really self-harming. I mean, drug abuse, pushing people away, addictive behavior, all of these things are expressions of the kind of negativity that's generated when you feel like the universe is not going your way and there's nothing you can do about it. Once you start feeling like, hey, I'm one with the direction of the universe and we're going in the same direction here, then there's a huge wave of relief. Now you can take that to the furthest extent into Buddhism, Stoicism, Epicureanism, and you can take that to the ascetics extent where you're so at peace with the universe that you don't want to do anything. You just want to sit around all day and meditate. So that's one extreme you can go to. But then there is an in-between where you're sort of in balance, where you accept teleology to one extent, but then you also see challenges in your own life that you can struggle and overcome. And there's something, it's reasonable, right? It's reasonable to play a video game because the video game has been constructed with the player in mind. So the obstacles in the video game are reasonable. They've been set up in such a way, they've been play tested, so that it's reasonable that a person can learn to adapt and overcome these given obstacles. When you sort of frame mythologically in your mind the direction of history in a way that things become reasonable again, then you can start having fun again. You can start enjoying challenges because they appear to be reasonable, rather than a universe in which everything is unreasonable, impossible, unworkable, just nightmarish and terrible. That's a hard way to live. That's a hard way to live. It's probably more enjoyable to look at the universe, to look at the moral landscape, and to see it as imperfect and problematic, but it's a necessary process. It's a necessary conflict that we have to go through in order to get to some higher hill or to some light at the end of the tunnel. There is hope, and it's not merely about going back. Because a lot of these people who have a view of history of like the past was perfect and the present is terrible, we just need to get back to the past. And when we're back into the past, everything's going to be great again. Well, that's a very cynical and Gnostic in a way, and it's like a I don't know how to say this, it's like a world-hating view where miso mundic might be the Latin amalgamation. A miso mundic view, a world-hating view where you're like, well, what's the point then? What's the point of, if the past was perfect, the 1950s were perfect, Roman Empire was perfect, sometime in the past was perfect, there was a golden age, and now we're in the Kali Yuga, now everything's horrible, everything's upside down, and we just need to get back. Well, then what's the point? Why are we going through this cycle? Why didn't we just stay in the past? Why are we bothering to go on this side quest or to venture out into this evil of the Kali Yuga? Why didn't we just stay in the golden age? It doesn't make sense. It's very frustrating. It's very, you get to, what's the term for God hating? Mesotheic? Just throwing out amalgamations here. So, or portmanteaus is the better word. What's the point of it all? Whereas if you see the past, right, as a legitimate past, a cohesive past, a past that makes sense, right? You have an environment, then you have a genetic structure called humanity that fits into the environment quite nicely and adapts. But eventually, humanity discovers this technology, and technology really changes the environment. And now, humanity doesn't fit in with the new environment that it created through technology. There's this mismatch. There's this uncomfortable dissonance that goes on. Everybody's addicted because we've created this hyperabundance, and our instincts weren't built for that hyperabundance. All of these problems. Okay, what do we do next? Do we just go back to being hunter-gatherers? Do we just blow up all technology and live like Ted Kaczynski? Well, then it's like, why did we make this side quest? Why did we bother going into the realm of technology? What was the point of it all? It seems like a meaningless use of our time. But if you instead view it as a kind of hero's journey, a Faustian journey, like Commons was arguing that you say, like, we have to go through this Faustianism, we have to explore this technology, and it's going to be really hard, it's going to be dark, it's going to be nightmarish. We feel like we're in the shadow of the valley of death. We feel like we're in hell, practically, to some extent. A lot of people really, if you look at drug addiction, if you look at sex addiction, if you look at social isolation, people living in their basements, social anxiety, people self-destructing, sociopathic behavior, sadistic behavior, narcissistic behavior, suicidal behavior, self-harm, all of these things, really do get nightmarish. When you start to get into the real extreme examples of serial killers, it's just like demons walking on the face of the planet. So it's really not a far stretch to say that the kingdom of heaven is within, but also the kingdom of hell is right here, right now, here on the planet Earth. That's not really a far stretch to make, psychologically speaking. So if we're dealing with that, what is the purpose of all this? Why are we going through this? Well, it's because by going through all of this, we're eventually going to get to a place where, as we were adapted to our environment, as a genetic structure adapted to the material environment, we change the environment, now we're in dissonance, we're actually going to pull ourselves up. Almost in a miraculous sense, we're going to pull ourselves up out of our old genetic infrastructure through technology. We're going to pull ourselves up to once again be cohesive and unified with our environment, which no other, well, I can't even say that, but it's a hard task. If you look at the dinosaurs, they existed for a while, and then they went through a mass extinction, and now they're little itty-bitty lizards and alligators and creatures like that. So for us to not only create the conditions for our own mass extinction, because that's really what we have done, we've created through atomic weaponry, through bioweaponry, and all these these systems, and even if we want to accept climate change, we could say that's a threat to humanity. But we've created all these threats to humanity: liberalism, capitalism, postmodernism, cultural Marxism, whatever, feminism. We've created threats to humanity: antinatalism, anti-religiousness. We've created these threats, and they threaten to destroy us. But the end of the hero's journey is that we through a Nietzschean process, through using technology, this is, I guess, what Tolkien feared. And Tolkien is really writing in the German tradition when he says, like, oh, Gondor was perfect and the world at its creation was perfect, and then Sauron just randomly started corrupting stuff, and he just came up with the Ring of Power that seduced people, and you can't use the ring because if you use the ring you become a slave of Sauron, and then eventually Sauron's going to win. So the only way to do it is you have to throw the ring in the fire. You have to destroy all technology, go back to living in your hobbit hole. And that's the good end of the story. And that's what Tolkien sets up. And it's a familiar and it's a seductive narrative because that's the good place that we know. We don't know what the good place is like to get over the hill and to be integrated with technology, to no longer exist as humanity, but to be something beyond humanity is scary. And there's change, and if there's change, there's thanatos, and there's fear. So we don't want to go through that. But if we have the courage to confront that, and to, if we're going to be in this hellscape, we're already going to be suicidal. Well, let's for a moment have an out-of-body experience. Let's look at things from the third person perspective. Let's look at evolutionary history. I mean, doesn't a dinosaur seem like a demon to you? Doesn't a lizard look kind of like a demon? Don't they kind of look demonic if you put an insect under a microscope or you look at bacteria? I mean, doesn't most species in the world kind of look demonic? Except for mammals. Why? Because we're related closely to mammals. So we view mammals as our kin, and they're cute and they're fuzzy and they're furry and they're beautiful. And humanity is furry and fuzzy and beautiful. Well, not so furry and fuzzy, but at least on the top of the head. And so we're attracted to these things because they're familiar to us, because they're close to us, because they're our kin. And we're disgusted to that which is distant from us and opposing us and predatory and has disease and infection and carries bacteria. So we're afraid of those things which are not like mammals, and we like those mammalian traits of altruism and collectivism and kindness and maternalism. I mean, mammals are one of the most maternal case-selective groups out of all the animal kingdom. I mean, there are others as well, but mammals especially, raising their young, long gestation periods. So this is something that's true of all mammals, and humans are just the most extreme. I mean, humans are just the most mammal of mammals in a way. So we do have this great anxiety about going beyond humanity, and distancing ourselves from our mammal cousins and escaping that familiar realm of the traditional animal kingdom. There's a huge degree of anxiety about that, which is understandable. So we can understand where it comes from. We don't have to hate it. We don't have to be angry at people in the way that liberals are angry at conservatives, in the way that liberals look down at rednecks. Like, we can understand humanity as an animal. We can understand it for what it is, and we can sympathize with it. But at the same time, in the same way we look at a child is afraid of the monster under the bed. We don't hate the child because of the child's irrational fear, but we actually have to love the child and coax the child and teach the child to be brave and to be courageous and to think rationally, and to overcome that childish fear of the monster under the bed, which today is technology. I mean, that's one way of looking at it. Maybe I'm totally wrong. Maybe the material world is all an illusion and this is a test, and if you go the Heideggerian, Tolkien, Ebert, if you go in that direction, you hate technology, then you win the secret test, and when you die, God will be up at the pearly gates and he'll say, congratulations, you passed the test, you were not seduced by technology, and now you're going to be reincarnated in a much cooler world. You're going to be reincarnated as a medieval knight or as a Roman centurion or as a Paleolithic hunter-gatherer, and life is going to be awesome. and your instinctual framework is going to match up perfectly with your environment. It's going to be like playing a video game 24/7, which really I believe is what Paleolithic life was like in a lot of ways, rather than the quote unquote like the Hobbesian view, nasty, brutish, short view of Paleolithic life. I think it was a hell of a time. I think it was an exciting time to be alive. If you're too late to be born a Paleolithic hunter-gatherer, true, but born just in time to go through the most challenging and unique set of circumstances that any life form on Earth has really ever gone through since the dawn of life. In a lot of ways, we're seeing what Jean-Francois Guérépi calls the phenotypic revolution, which is a little more. It's not just a singularity, as I've, don't quote me on this, but hopefully I've learned to stop using the word singularity. Phenotypic revolution is a good term, that we're going through a phenotypic revolution, and that's exciting. And we're not there yet. Once we do get there, it's going to be huge, undeniable. Everyone's going to understand. It's going to be just awakening, universal awakening. But we're not there yet, and in the meantime, there's a lot of confusion to clear up, and you have to go through a lot of levels. So you have to start with people at the most basic, I was a utopian liberal, and then I became enlightened, and I became a conservative. And it's like, okay, well, yeah, if you're a conservative, you're still buying into a lot of lies about the world. Oh, well, I was a conservative, then I became a white nationalist. Okay, well, you're still buying into a lot of lies about demographics and power and theory of revolution and things like that, and you're really buying into a mainstream narrative. Don't you see how they're kind of puffing you up in order to beat you down as a social mechanism of control for the purpose of intersectionality? And doesn't that argument make sense? And so people are resistant, and there are liberals who will never be conservatives who will never be white nationalists, and white nationalists who will never be hypermodern. And I like that term. We're going to play with that term, just like we played with the terms right versus left. We're going to play with this term hypermodern for now, at least in this video. We'll see where the future takes us. That's enough for now. Thanks for listening. I'll see you next time.